Morning, dear students. Today we are going to discuss paper first, that is British poetry, and we are going to take the block number third. In the block number third, romantic poetry is very important feature that we are going to cover up here. And first we would like to discuss the romantic poetry. Romanticism, a philosophical, literary, artistic and cultural era which began in the middle or the late 18th century as a reaction against the prevailing Enlightenment ideals of the day. Romantics favored more natural, emotional, and personal artistic themes, also influenced poetry, inevitably the characterization of a broad range of contemporary poets under the single unifying name can be viewed more as an exercise in historical temperament than an attempt to capture the essence of the actual movement. So, my dear friends, as you can notice in this slide, that the romantic poetry that started in the mid or in the last of 18th century was a very prominent kind of movement that overshadowed the whole of English literature and tried to start a new kind of poetry in English literature that is known for its variety, that is known for its nature elements, and that is known for its romantic elements in the poetry. So, in the slide we can see, my dear friends, that it was a reaction. It was a reaction against the prevailing Enlightenment ideas of the contemporary time and period. So, that is why actually this period started, this poetry, romantic poetry started, and that created a kind of different atmosphere altogether in English literature and in poetry. As a matter of fact, romantic poetry, you see, poets such as William Wordsworth were actively engaged in trying to create a new kind of poetry that emphasized the intuition over reason and the pastoral over the urban, often eschewing consciously poetic language in an effort to use more colloquial language. Wordsworth himself in the preface to his and Coleridge's lyrical ballads defined good poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So, actually, Wordsworth, the very famous poet of romantic poetry, called that the poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It is very much spontaneous, it is automatic, it comes, and it is a very precise and very natural overflow of powerful feelings. That was the greatest definition of poetry, my dear friends, that was given by Wordsworth. Though in the same sentence he goes on to clarify the statement by asserting that nonetheless any poem of value must still be composed by a man possessed of more than usual organic sensibility, also thought long and deeply. He also emphasized the importance of the use of meter in poetry, which he views as one of the key features of poetry actually. Although many people stress the notion of spontaneity in romantic poetry, the movement was still greatly concerned with the pain of composition, of translating these emotive responses into poetic form. Indeed, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, another prominent romantic poet and critic in his own, poesy or art seen art as the mediatrix between the reconciler of nature and man. Such an attitude reflects what might be called the dominant theme of romantic poetry, the flirting of natural emotion through the human mind in order to create art coupled with an awareness of the duality created by such a process. So, in this slide we can very well see, my dear friends, that the romantic poetry has the feelings of William Wordsworth that was expressed by him in the very famous line of poetry. The poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. And later on, actually, this movement, this romantic movement, this romantic poetry has got all the elements of spontaneity, preciseness, nature, supernaturalism, etc. So, actually, the elements of spontaneity were observed and were approved of by many other poets also of this period. So, we can say, as a matter of fact, that the romantic poetry which was started by William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge reached to its culmination in the hands of P.V. Shelley, George Gordon, Lord Byron, John Keats, etc. And now, you see, we will discuss, that is in your syllabus, William Blake, one of the prime and important poets of Romantic poetry. He was one of the beginners actually, who started the Romantic poetry in English literature, and he was a precursor of the Romantic poetry. He is known as the precursor of Romantic poetry. William Blake, who was born on 28th November 1757 and died on 12th August 1827, was an English poet, painter, and printmaker, largely unrecognized during his lifetime. Blake is now considered a seminal figure in the history of the poetry and visual arts of the Romantic age. His prophetic poetry has been said to form what is in the proportion to its merit and least read body of poetry in the English language. His visual artistry led one contemporary art critic to proclaim him far and away the greatest artist Britain has ever produced. In 2002, Blake was placed at number 38 in the BBC's poll of the 100 greatest Britons. Although he lived in London his entire life, except for 3 years spent in Feltham, he produced a diverse and symbolically rich overview of English poetry, which embraced the imagination as the body of God or human existence itself. So, my dear friends, as we were talking about William Blake, he was a very famous poet, painter, and printmaker who was not that much recognized in his lifetime, and later on he became a very important figure of Romantic age and Romantic poetry. His prophetic poetry is known as what is in proportion to its merit and the least read body of poetry in English language. That is what is known about his poetry. He was nominated as one of the top 100 Britons of his time by BBC. William Blake, considered mad by contemporaries for his views. Blake is held in high regard by later critics of his expressiveness and creativity, and for the philosophical and mystical undercurrents within his work. His paintings and poetry have been characterized as part of the Romantic movement and pre-Romantic for its large prurience in the 18th century, reverent of the Bible but hostile to the Church of England. Indeed, to all forms of organized religion, Blake was influenced by the ideals and ambitions of the French and American revolutions. Though later he rejected many of these political activists, Thomas Paine, he was also influenced by thinkers such as Emanuel Swedenborg. Despite these known influences, the singularity of Blake's work makes him difficult to classify. The 19th century scholar William Rossetti characterized him as a glorious luminary and a man not forestalled by predecessors, nor to be classed with contemporaries, nor to be replaced by known or readily surmisable successors. So, as a matter of fact, my dear friends, we were talking about William Blake, and who was a very important precursor of the Romantic period, one of the important poets who started Romantic poetry in English literature. So actually he was a person who started a pre-Romantic, as you can very well see in this slide. He was the person who started the pre-Romantic movement in English literature, and he was very much influenced by French and American movements, American revolutions, my dear friends. So his impact, my dear friends, on English literature is very wide, is very influential, my dear friends. And the other important character, the other important poet of English literature and this Romantic poetry is William Wordsworth, my dear friends. He was the greatest of nature poetry. He was the greatest of the Romantic poetry, and his name in English literature is taken with respect and with utmost care. He was such a great poet. He was born on 7th April 1770 and died on 23rd April 1850. He was a major English Romantic poet who with Samuel Taylor Coleridge helped to launch the Romantic period in English literature with the 1798 joint publication of lyrical ballads. My dear friends, you must be aware of the fact that the Romantic period officially was started in 1798, and it was the launching of the famous book that is known as Lyrical Ballads that was jointly written by William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge, that got published in 1798. And the date of the publication is the date of the Romantic movement, my dear friends. From that day, Romantic movement started, my dear friends. So these two persons, William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge, were there behind the Romantic movement. They were behind the curtain who started this Romantic poetry, this Romantic movement, my dear friends. Wordsworth's magnum opus is generally considered to be the Prelude, very famous semi-autobiographical poem of his early years, which he revised and expanded a number of times. It was posthumously titled and published, prior to which it was generally known as the Poem to Coleridge. Wordsworth was Britain's poet laureate. This is a very important point, my dear friends. He was made poet laureate in 1843 after Robert Southey. Robert Southey was the one who was the poet laureate until 1843, and after that he was made, William Wordsworth was made the poet laureate, and he was there as poet laureate until he died. That is 1850. In 1850 he died, and he was there on the post of poet laureate till he died. So by this slide we can understand, my dear friends, that this was the Prelude, that was a magnum opus of William Wordsworth, very famous poetry of William Wordsworth. The Prelude, or Growth of a Poet's Mind, an autobiographical poem. It is a semi-autobiographical poem, as we have discussed, conversation poem in blank verse by the English poet William Wordsworth, intended as the introduction to the more philosophical recluse which Wordsworth never finished. The Prelude is an extremely personal and revealing work on the details of Wordsworth's life. Wordsworth began the Prelude in 1798 at the age of 28 and continued to work on it throughout his life. The Prelude was eventually published posthumously in 1850 by Wordsworth's wife, Mary Wordsworth. He never gave it a title. He called it the poem, title not yet fixed upon, to Coleridge. Poem to Coleridge was the title. That was the poem which was usually pronounced by William Wordsworth to this poem, and in his letters to Dorothy Wordsworth referred to it as the poem on the growth of my own mind. This was the title that was referred by William Wordsworth when he wrote something or some letters to his sister Dorothy Wordsworth, and he called it the poem on the growth of my own mind. The poem was unknown to the general public until published 3 months after Wordsworth's death in 1850. Its final name given to it by his widow Mary. So there are some important points, my dear friends, in this slide. The Prelude, that was known as the growth of a poet's mind also, that was an autobiographical poem. William Wordsworth didn't give any formal name to this poem. William Wordsworth didn't give any formal name to this poem, but the formal name was given to this poem by his widow Mary. So Prelude, as we can understand, my dear friends, through this slide, was a very important poem for William Wordsworth, and in this poem particularly he talks about the different features of his life. That is why it is a semi-autobiographical poetry by the pen of William Wordsworth. Another very important name is S.T. Coleridge, who is known as Samuel Taylor Coleridge, my dear friends. And he was one of the most important poets of English literature, as well as Romantic poetry also. And he was the one who along with Mr. Wordsworth, tried to launch Romantic period, and it was the lyrical ballads, the publication of lyrical ballads, the joint venture of S.T. Coleridge and William Wordsworth, and that actually, as a matter of fact, launched the Romantic poetry, Romantic movement. Now we will discuss Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was born on 21st October 1772 and died on 25th July 1834, was an English poet, literary critic and philosopher who with his friend William Wordsworth was a founder of the Romantic movement in England and a member of the Lake Poets. He wrote the poems The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Kubla Khan, as well as the major prose work of Biographia Literaria. His critical work, especially on Shakespeare, was highly influential, and he helped introduce German idealist philosophy to English-speaking culture. He coined many familiar words and phrases, including the celebrated willing suspension of disbelief. He was a major influence on Emerson and American transcendentalism. As we have discussed, my dear friends, he was a very important poet of supernaturalism and romantic poetry as well, and he was the one who actually wrote very important poems like Kubla Khan, like The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, like Christabel, etc., and the very famous prose work known as Biographia Literaria. He was a great influence on different other people. Throughout his adult life, Coleridge suffered from crippling bouts of anxiety and depression. It has been speculated by some that he suffered from bipolar disorder, a condition not identified during his lifetime. Coleridge suffered from poor health that may have stemmed from a bout of rheumatic fever and other childhood illness. He was treated for these concerns that fostered a lifelong opium addiction. He was an opium eater, so that was because of his disease. Kubla Khan. Kubla Khan is the poem, my dear friends, that is there in your syllabus, that was composed by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, completed in 1797 and published in 1816. According to Coleridge's preface to Kubla Khan, the poem was composed one night after he experienced an opium-influenced dream after reading a work describing Xanadu, the summer place of Mongol ruler and emperor of China, Kublai Khan. Upon waking, he set about writing lines of poetry that came to him from the dream until he was interrupted by a person from Pollock. The poem could not be completed according to its original 200-300 line plan, as the interruption caused him to forget the lines. He left it unpublished and kept it for private readings for his friends until 1816, when on the prompting by George Gordon Byron, it was published. So, in the first half of the slide, we can understand, my dear friends, in a dream, actually, William S.T. Coleridge experienced this poem that was as Kubla Khan, and actually later on when he started jotting down the poetry, but some person came and he interrupted him. And because of that, the whole flow got disturbed and he could not write the whole poem. So that is why the poem was left unfinished and he could not publish the poetry. Later on, Byron insisted him, and then it was published. Some of Coleridge's contemporaries denounced the poem and questioned his story about its origin. It was not until years later that critics began to openly admire the poem. Most modern critics now view Kubla Khan as one of Coleridge's three great poems, with The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Christabel. The poem is considered one of the most famous examples of Romanticism in English poetry. A copy of the manuscript is permanent exhibit at the British Museum in London. So, you can very well see, my dear friends, that this poetry first was not much liked. Later on, critics started appreciating the poetry Kubla Khan, and it was one of the most important poems written by the pen of S.T. Coleridge, one of the trumps of Romantic poetry, and it is one of the most important examples of English poetry also at the same time. Rejection and Ode was also written by S.T. Coleridge, and you can very well see Rejection and Ode was also a very important poem. It is a poem written by Samuel Taylor Coleridge in 1802. The poem in its original form was written to Sarah Hutchison, a woman who was not his life, and discusses his feelings of love for her. The various versions of the poem describe Coleridge's inability to write poetry and living in a state of paralysis, but published editions and remove his personal feelings and mention of Hutchinson. So, in this slide, we can very well see that this is a very important poem in which actually S.T. Coleridge talks about his inner feelings actually, and the feelings that he had for Sarah Hutchinson. Sarah Hutchinson was a woman and for whom this poem was written. This poem, as a matter of fact, my dear friends, was written in 1802, and because this poem was written to a lady who was known as Sarah Hutchinson, therefore S.T. Coleridge expresses his feelings in this poem, and the internal feelings of S.T. Coleridge are expressed in this poem. It has a kind of internal dilemmas, internal anxieties, internal sufferings of the mind of Coleridge's mind. As has been discussed in the earlier slides, my dear friends, that S.T. Coleridge was an opium eater. So actually he had the dreamy kind of style of writing. So actually the Rejection and Ode, that it has got a kind of anxieties, the internal dilemmas of poet's internal mind. The title, Rejection and Ode, also clarifies, clearly expresses the very mindset of the poet in which circumstances the poem was written. There are two things important, my dear friends, in the title of the poem, Rejection and an Ode. Dejection is a very simple word. Dejection is a state of anxiety. Dejection is a state of frustration. Dejection is a state or a condition in which one is not very much happy. So this is a kind of an internal state. This is a condition of S.T. Coleridge, in which condition he is not very much happy, and then actually he wrote this poem in 1802. The second thing, an ode. An ode actually, if you remember, in the block 1, in the first paper, we discussed the various forms of poetry. Various forms of poetry. In that particular session, we discussed about ode also, my dear friends. So if you remember, ode is an addressed song, my dear friends. Ode is an addressed song. Ode is a kind of an addressed song in which you see the feelings, the messages, the mindset is expressed of a particular person. And those feelings are addressed to one particular thing or a person or an idea or an event that is known as an ode. Ode basically is an addressed song. So, this poem written by S.T. Coleridge, Rejection and Ode, is also basically an addressed song. And that is addressed to whom, my dear friends? It is addressed to Sarah Hutchinson. So, this was a kind of a bit clarification. Rejection and Ode was a poem written by S.T. Coleridge in 1802, and it is an ode. It is basically an addressed song that was written to Sarah Hutchinson. The poem was reply to William Wordsworth's Resolution and Independence. It is also connected to Wordsworth's Immortality Ode in theme and structure. The poem expresses feelings of dejection and the inability to write poetry or to enjoy nature. Wordsworth is introduced into the poem as a counter to Coleridge because Wordsworth is able to turn such a mood into a benefit and is able to comfort it. However, Coleridge cannot find anything positive in his problems, and he expresses how he feels paralyzed by his emotions. This source of their paralysis was Coleridge's feelings for Hutchinson and problems dealing with his marriage. However, Coleridge couldn't have been completely in dejection, or he would have been unable to create the poem. So, as we were discussing, my dear friends, earlier also, that this poem, Rejection and Ode, it was a kind of internal feelings. It is a presentation of internal feelings of S.T. Coleridge. This poem was, as a matter of fact, written by S.T. Coleridge as a response to William Wordsworth's Resolution and Independence. It is also connected to Wordsworth's Immortality Ode also in its theme and structure, my dear friends. So, actually, this poem expresses the feelings of Coleridge. That was the mood of Coleridge that he had in those days. And it is the poem actually, Sarah, as a matter of fact, I would like to tell you, my dear friends, was the wife of William Wordsworth. So they were together actually. William Wordsworth and Coleridge are known as lake poets. So they were together. And so the feelings of the minds of Coleridge are expressed in this poem that is known as Rejection and Ode, my dear friends. And in this poem, actually, he was not that much dejected. Otherwise, he would not have been able to write the whole poem that is known as Rejection and Ode. But he was a bit frustrated, he was a bit anxious, and those feelings of his mind, those desires of his mind, those internal dilemmas of his mind are expressed in this poem. So that is why actually this poem is entitled as Rejection and Ode. Rejection and Ode. Rejection and Ode. The poem also captures some feelings in Coleridge's previous works, especially in analyzing a problematic childhood, an exploration of religion. Partly these feelings were fueled by his inability to accept his opium addiction and other problems. The poems also contain Coleridge's desires for Hutchinson, but these were late removed from the printed edition of the works. The editions are so different that they reflect the conflict and division that Coleridge felt during 1802. The tone of the poems are different. The original was passionate and emotional, and the printed version was organized and philosophical. So as we can see in the slide, that the poem expresses those important feelings, my dear friends, that were there in the mind of S.T. Coleridge. And he, as a matter of fact, expresses a comparative study of the childhood and the young age, and later on when they became the important poets and the important movement leaders of the Romantic poetry, my dear friends. So this poem, as a matter of fact, expresses, on the other hand, Coleridge's inner desires for Hutchinson also. It has, you see, as I have introduced you, Sarah Hutchinson became the wife of William Wordsworth, and because they were together, so they had that kind of intimacy. So actually, as a matter of fact, this poem expresses that intimate movements that were there between all of them, and Coleridge was a bit anxious about Sarah Hutchinson, and that feelings, that rejection, that anxiety has been expressed in this particular poem. It has got a kind of passion, it has got the emotional feelings, it has got the internal desires of Coleridge. So all those points have been expressed in this poem, my dear friends, and there is a connection between rejection and frost at midnight. Frost at midnight in everything but its form. This is primarily true of the original version, but many of the personal elements of the poem continue over into the published version. The trimming of the poem allows for Coleridge to emphasize the most important poetic aspects of the original and to create a separation of the form from the subject area, which allows for a strong incongruity not in the original. So, my dear friends, as we can see in the slide, that it has got, the poem, the Rejection and Ode, has got a very important link, a very important connection with Frost at Midnight. it has got a very strong similarity. So both of the poems have got some similar things, some positive connections that are there found between both of the poems. And you see, the both of the poems are very much connected in their nature, in their subject, and in their form. So now you see, in this today's session, we have discussed about the romantic poetry, my dear friends, and the romantic poetry, how it started, how the romantic poetry started, the precursor of romantic poetry, including William Blake, William Wordsworth, and S.T. Coleridge. At the same time, we have discussed some important works, some important movements about all of them. I think you have enjoyed the session. Thank you very much, my dear friends. Thank you.